Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte and welcome back to Situ, Operation Wallacea's online lecture series. I'm really excited to welcome Dr Jonathan Kolby to our series this week. John is a scientist that I worked with on my first expedition with Operation Wallacea, and I remember his research from then. He's going to tell us all about the global threats that are facing amphibian populations and whether there's a light at the end of the tunnel for them. So I'm going to hand over to John. Thank you for watching and come back and watch the rest of our series.
Hi everyone, my name is Jonathan Kolby, and today I'll be talking to you about my presentation called Hope in the Midst of the Amphibian Extinction Crisis. So globally, there's over 8,000 species of amphibians, and that includes frogs, toads, and caecilians, which are legless, salamander-like creatures. The diversity is enormous, and they're beautiful and amazing animals. But unfortunately, it's increasingly evident that around the world, amphibians are disappearing. And that's due to a number of different threats, ranging from habitat destruction, pollution, overexploitation for different kinds of trade. But what I focus on is disease. And specifically, a disease called Amphibian Chytrid Fungus. This is an aquatic fungal pathogen. The scientific name is called Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis. And what it is it lives in the water. It swims around. So it's a fungus, but it almost moves like an animal with a little flagellate tail until it hits an amphibian, where it latches on and burrows into the skin to the area that creates keratin. And that's where it starts to grow and causes damage to the function of the skin. And for amphibians, that's so incredibly important that the skin is left intact and healthy, because that is the main organ that allows it to breathe and exchange gases and chemicals with this environment. So when you start destroying the skin of the amphibian, it just eventually causes all sorts of havoc and eventually death in many of these amphibians. Although wildlife diseases are nothing new, this one in particular is really scary and devastating because it is truly the first disease that has gone global and is causing extinctions in multiple continents, in many, many species, all at the same time, and it's really overwhelming. So where is chytrid? As you can see, and this is already a little bit out of date, but chytrid has already been detected in over 60 countries. It's been found in hundreds of amphibian species. It's still spreading. It's still encroaching into even protected areas. And that's one of the things that scares me the most about these diseases, is that it almost goes against the conventional way of thinking about conservation, where we think, oh, if we have a protected area, we can protect a species. But now we're seeing right in front of us that diseases don't respect boundaries. Physical, political, environmental. Humans are spreading these diseases, and even in a protected area, you will find extinctions. So what I looked at during my PhD, which I won't go into too much detail right now, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I did my PhD a few years ago at James Cook University in Australia, studying the global spread of chytrid fungus, because I wanted to understand how did it get so bad so fast. How much of it is caused potentially by humans versus natural ways. So I looked at every way I could think of that it was probably spreading. And long story short, I also detected it every way that I looked for it. So that's a whole nother story. But at the same time that I was looking at how is it spreading around the world, I started working with Operation Wallacea in Honduras and studying the amphibians and reptiles of Cusuco National Park. And Cusuco is just the most incredible, amazing rainforest you can think of. Traditionally, when we think of rainforest, a lot of people think warm and tropical and hot and steamy, but Cusuco is so unique because it's a cloud forest. And that means it's a forest on top of a mountain at a higher elevation where it's cool and kind of temperate and montane, and literally these clouds just land on you. And every now and then you're bathed in an ocean of cloud. And because of that, the animals that live here are really unique, and some of them are found nowhere else in the world. So, I mean, this is now pretty much what I consider my second home. I've started working here in 2006 and pretty much never stopped. I've lived about 2 years of my life inside this forest. So this is my office, which I consider myself pretty lucky about. This is my bedroom at base camp. Those of you that have been to Cusuco know what it's like at base camp. This is my shower. And these are some of my neighbors. So we've got frogs that look like Kermit. You've got insects that look like dead leaves. You've got insects that are crazy armored. You've got snakes that laugh and shout. You've got caterpillars that look like dragons. Butterflies with racing stripes and caterpillars that look like they have feathers. You've got lizards with mohawks and spiders that throw their webs at you. But I'm here for the frogs. So I started working here, as I mentioned, in 2006. And after my first year, when I was preparing to come back in 2007, I was teaching myself a lot more about these frogs that we were studying. And that's when I started reading IUCN Red List assessments that said a number of these animals were critically endangered and endemic to Cusuco, found nowhere else in the world, and they were disappearing, and no one really knew why. And although, there are increasing pressures on Cusuco with deforestation and land use changes, back in 2006, it wasn't very evident, and it was really perplexing why these animals would be disappearing. And that's when I learned about Chytrid fungus. So I was fortunate to receive my first grant from National Geographic as a young explorer and did my first investigation to consider, could Chytrid fungus be why these frogs are disappearing from Cusuco? And if so, what does that mean for conservation? And what can we do about it? So meanwhile, after many years of doing these surveys, which I'll get to later, we also really wanted to understand as much as we could about these frogs, because the ability to protect a species is only as good as our understanding of what do they do, what do they need, what do they like, how do they behave. And a lot of these are really complex questions to answer just by looking at something quickly. So it takes a lot of long-term ecological observations, which is what me and my team have been doing. So we did some radio tracking. We made these little tiny waist belts for frogs to carry micro radio transmitters, and following them around the forest floor to see where they were going and what they were doing. It was often a concerted team effort to tag these frogs and follow them. I also did some tagging of frogs, kind of like giving them little frog tattoos, because we also really need to understand at a population level how many different frogs are we seeing. And that can be really complex when these frogs are hard to tell apart from one to the next. So we trialed some methods such as alphanumeric visual implant elastomers. I wanted to know what was happening to the frogs up in the trees. We often think of Chytrid fungus as a disease that affects animals that primarily are in permanent water bodies, so lakes and rivers. But no one was really talking much about the amphibians that live way up in the tree that maybe never have to come to the ground. So in Cusuco, we have two species of frogs, these amazing frogs called bromeliad frogs. And what they are is they're a species of tree frog that lives inside bromeliads, which are these plants that anchor themselves to the side of trees and have almost a big tank in the center where they collect rainwater and leaf matter and all sorts of stuff and insects. And they basically support the entire life cycle of these frogs. So as you can see here, you can even find tadpoles of these frogs inside these little cups of water. So to understand what was the threat to these frogs, we had to observe these frogs and sample these frogs. So at first, we weren't very good at climbing trees. So we went to tree climbing school and got certified in canopy access rope techniques. And that was a whole lot of fun. And whoever says that science isn't sporty is wrong. So, what have we learned in the past 10 years? In a nutshell, as always, there's good news and there's bad news. First, the good news. During these investigations, I rediscovered a frog called Miles rain frog, Crogastrum merlesi, which had been declared extinct. And it's a fascinating example of how little we know about some of these really cryptic, hard to find animals. It hadn't been seen since the mid-1980s and was believed to have gone extinct from Chytrid fungus. So, as you can imagine, I was just incredibly thrilled to find one of these frogs that I was writing about the extinction of. They're still extremely rare. We found a few of them since then, but we still don't understand whether they're potentially bouncing back from the verge of extinction, or are they still on the edge of extinction? But nonetheless, to find any individuals of something considered extinct is just a dream come true. But unfortunately, there's a heck of a lot of bad news. And that is that pretty much everywhere I looked for chytrid fungus, if I looked hard enough, I found it. We found it in the rivers, we found it up in the trees, in the tree frogs, even in the water, pooled inside these plants, and even in the rainwater itself, I was able to find chytrid fungus. And that brings us to what I consider the global conservation challenge for amphibians. We're facing a global amphibian extinction crisis, largely because chytrid fungus just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading, partly caused by humans through the wildlife trade, and partly because we've already introduced it to so many places, and we just cannot stop it without hurting good things at the same time. And that's the challenge, is what do? We're running out of space and time and money in zoos to just collect more and more and more species, but we know that if we don't, a lot of these frogs are going to go extinct. So that's why myself and my colleagues decided many years ago that our solution, or at least our best effort for a solution, is to establish a rescue program in Honduras, which we call the Honduras Amphibian Rescue and Conservation Center. And basically what this takes shape as at the moment, is it is a facility based at Lancitia Botanical Gardens inside these 2 ocean shipping containers that have been retrofitted on the inside into basically a frog hospital, with systems of shelves and aquaria and plumbing and electricity and climate control to try to replicate the environment of Cusuco National Park inside these shipping containers, where we can house frogs that we take out of the park before they die from chytrid fungus, and give it our best effort to keep them alive until they develop a stronger immune system and we can put them back in Cusuco where they belong. There's 3 species that we selected to be our candidate rescue species to begin with. The first one is the exquisite spike-thumb frog, Plectrohyla exquisita. It's the biggest tree frog in Cusuco, about the size of a fist. Huge smiley face, really unique. As you can see, they're called spike-thumb frogs, and it's because they almost have what looks like a second thumb, which is actually a bone dagger that they use when fighting for territory. The second species is the Cusuco spike-thumb frog, which is the smaller cousin of the exquisite spike-thumb. And both this one and the previous one not only are critically endangered, but are also endemic to Cusuco. So they are found in a few rivers, but nowhere else in the world. And thirdly is the mossy red-eyed frog, Plectrohyla ceralia, which is our version of the red-eyed tree frog, but much fancier. And now I'm just going to show you a quick 3-minute video that Katie Garrett produced for National Geographic that explains really well the concept of the Honduras Amphibian Rescue and Conservation Center.
I think it's unfortunate that the first major wildlife disease outbreak in the world is affecting frogs, because a lot of people don't perceive frogs as charismatic and cute and important. But frogs have amazing personalities themselves. They are just as important in the environment as these large animals as well. And they're beautiful. Cusuco National Park is a montane cloud forest in northwestern Honduras. There is an amazing wealth of biodiversity, and especially for the reptiles and amphibians. It was recently assessed as in the top 25 sites in the world for its unique and imperiled amphibian diversity.
Maquilín Ramírez es el nombre. Yo tengo 82 años. Yo vivo aquí en el parque. Se han terminado muchas razas de ranas. Pues más poco, menos cantan, ya no se oyen cantar mucho. La cría de ranas ya no hay, ya no son las mismas. Y se necesita salvarlos, porque de repente se terminan.
So amphibian chytrid fungus is an aquatic fungal pathogen. It's one of the first wildlife diseases that has truly gone global by the time we knew it existed. It's leading to one of the largest mass extinctions that we have ever documented.
I've been working alongside Jonathan Kolby since 2010 here in Cusuco National Park. Through the research that we've been doing, we came to understand that chytrid was greatly affecting a lot of the populations of frogs here, and specifically some of the endemic species.
Frogs play a really important role in the food chain, so they support many organisms. Particularly there's one snake species here that's an amphibian specialist, so it preys almost exclusively on amphibians, and it's thought to have population declines itself, which is almost as a direct result of amphibian populations crashing.
As the tadpole metamorphoses into a frog, its immune system suppresses because the tadpole begins to develop totally new organ systems that of an adult animal. The stage of metamorphosis is most often when they succumb to disease from chytrid. We have now established the Honduras Amphibian Rescue and Conservation Center, which means removing the younger, weaker animals before they die from chytrid, curing them, raising them till they're stronger, healthy adults, and then reintroducing them.
What happens with a lot of rescue efforts is you take populations from the wild, you get them in captivity, and then reintroduction doesn't always happen. So the plan for HARCC, I think, is unique.
I think HARCC is a fantastic initiative, especially for the conservation of these really special species in the park. They're a pleasure to see in their natural environment, and I would love it if in future years I can see their populations increase as a direct result of it.
So now, at the same time that we're planning to rescue these frogs, another increasing threat is deforestation. And that's where the work that Opwall is doing is so incredibly important, because, once we have these frogs in our rescue facility, they need a place to go back to. They need to have their home protected. And in recent years, we've just seen so much illegal deforestation in Cusuco. And the challenge is just increasing every day. Every time we go back, we see more deforestation. So yeah, I can't emphasize enough how important the work of Operation Wallacea is in Cusuco National Park. And you might have noticed that a lot of what I've been talking about centers around frogs. And you may or may not be wondering, well, what about salamanders? Well, interestingly, for quite a while, and by that I mean for the past 20 years or so, chytrid fungus was identified in 1999. So we've been studying this ever since. And we knew that salamanders could become infected, but it didn't seem like they were really dying as much from chytrid fungus as frogs were. But unfortunately, several years ago in the Netherlands, fire salamanders started dropping dead. And people, of course, at first thought chytrid fungus, the one that we're familiar with. But long story short, it wasn't. Instead, it was actually a different species of chytrid fungus, which is now starting to spread around the world all over again. And this time, as unhappy irony, it's mostly affecting salamanders, but not frogs. So you just can't win if you're an amphibian. And that's why, we talk a lot these days about citizen science and how important citizen science can be to researchers and governments. So fortunately, salamander chytrid fungus has not yet been found in the Western Hemisphere. So it hasn't been found in North America or South America. It's mostly been found in Asia, recently spread to Europe through the pet trade. And we're just kind of trying to do everything we can to either protect ourselves from its arrival or prepare for when it does. And that means knowing when it gets here as fast as we can. So I've started a citizen science program where on a website called iNaturalist, I have a page called Saving Salamanders with Citizen Science, where any of you, if you ever see a dead salamander anywhere in the world, but even especially in North or South America, including Cusuco, please take a photograph and upload it to this project on iNaturalist. And when anything unusual arises, like a mass mortality or just something really, unsettling, I then curate those records and contact the local wildlife authorities as needed and give them the information to empower them to decide if they want to do a rapid response field surveillance project. And that has happened several times so far. And luckily, no one has found salamander chytrid fungus, but one of these days, they might. And so some of you might be thinking at this point, what's the big deal? Why does it matter if frogs go extinct? And there's a lot of reasons why it matters if frogs go extinct. Frogs form such an integral part of many food webs. They're incredibly abundant in the environment. So because they have a life cycle that spans the water and the land, when they're in the water, a lot of their tadpoles eat plant matter and almost act as aquatic lawnmowers, keeping the algae and plant matter at bay that otherwise could rot and degrade water quality, which matters for the other wildlife living in the water and for people that rely on those water sources for drinking if they don't have access to water treatment. Just as well, they sometimes also eat a lot of insects that could spread human diseases. So, flies and mosquitoes that could spread dengue and malaria and Zika. The absence of frogs definitely has an impact on those insect populations, which in turn has an impact on human health. And thirdly, because they are such abundant animals, it's just so much biomass that is also providing food for a kaleidoscope of other animals, for everything from snakes to mammals to birds. A lot of the food that feeds these animals comes from amphibians. So when you start taking these puzzle pieces out of the forest, out of the ecosystems, there's a lot of knock-on effects that we can't always predict and know with certainty, what will and won't be affected until the damage is done and can no longer be repaired. And this causes, an increasing issue in the world of the spread of animal diseases and thankfully an increasing recognition of the connection between the health of wildlife and the health of people and the health of the environment. And that's what we call One Health, which is finally beginning to gain traction, especially with the emergence of COVID-19, coronavirus. To people who study these diseases and wildlife health, we've known for a very long time that there are often spillover events from people living closer and closer to wildlife, from increased wildlife trade, and just from how fast in today's globalized world, everything is becoming connected. And we need to give an eye to the importance of the health of the wildlife around us. And not just wait every time until it affects humans, but before it does. And that way, not only do we protect biodiversity, which has a million reasons why that needs to be done, but it also protects humans at the same time. And if you're interested in the bigger issue at hand, this is something I'm actively researching and working to push forward right now, is just the virtual lack of control of moving diseases around the world in the wildlife trade. There's a common perception that it's only the illegal wildlife trade that spreads diseases. But from my experience working with the government and working as a scientist and a researcher, that, my experience says otherwise, that it's actually, there is such a ginormous legal trade that most people don't see or understand. But they just kind of assume that if animals are sick or diseased, that they're not allowed to move from country to country. But in many, many circumstances, that's not the case. We just don't have policies and regulations until people are affected or until livestock are affected. And often by the time that happens, it's too late to stop a lot of these outbreaks, and many wildlife species are damaged in the process. So if you're interested in reading more about this, just last week, a story I published with National Geographic is called "To Prevent the Next Pandemic." It's the legal wildlife trade we should worry about. Give it a read. I highly recommend it. And I'd like to close on a note from Kermit the Frog that says, "If it seems to me that if you wait until the frogs and toads have croaked their last to take some action, you've missed the point." I'm always happy to answer questions. There was a lot that I went through fairly quickly here. If you want to talk about Cusuco, about frogs, about my PhD, wildlife health in general, you name it, science communication, I'm really big on. Don't be shy to reach out to me. And thanks for watching.